Jews in the Oppression Binary by Stephen Michael Berk. I'm a PhD student in anti-Semitism studies at Gratz College. This is the Contemporary Anti-Semitism Conference, July 7th through 9th, 2026, at the University of Haifa in Haifa, Israel. I'd like to start out by talking about Columbia University. Pictured here is Manoush Shafik, who was the president of Columbia at the time of the October 7th, 2023 attacks in Israel. Columbia University is a university which allegedly privileges the oppressed over the oppressor. It has the Edward Said Chair, the Center for Palestine Studies, the work of Rashid Khalidi, historian who, although he retired recently, wrote Palestinian history, and Students for Justice in Palestine is well situated on the campus. Then, after October 7th, the paradigm shifted, and Columbia was charged with oppressing its own Jewish students. Claire Shipman was caught calling Jewish board member Shoshana Shendelman a mole. The university closed off its campus to outside media, suggesting projections of guilt and shame for how it was treating its own Jewish students. And the university was charged with civil rights violations for shared ancestry. But this is not the only example of Jews and the state of Israel challenging what I'm calling normative oppression. There is Edward Said's notion of the victim of the victim, referring to Jewish victimhood, then in turn victimizing Palestinian people. Oppressed pogromists in Eastern Europe and Tsarist Russia, in turn oppressing Jews in the region. Anti-Semites on both the left and the right decrying Jewish power and dominance. And the state of Israel being charged with the country as being a country of both the left and the right, colonizer and colonized, complicit in hate, but also defending against hate in its own right. How can we explain all this? Oppression, by which I mean the space between oppressor and oppressed, is a false binary. Jews and the state of Israel transcend this binary as they cannot normatively be placed in either category. Let's go over the presentation layout. I will challenge normative conceptions of oppression, that is, the oppressor oppresses the oppressed. I will conclude that Jews and the state of Israel cannot normatively be categorized as the oppressor nor the oppressed, that any attempt to do so, in particular post-Edward Said attempts to name Jews and Israel as the oppressor, is ultimately a subjective knowledge, and that this knowledge invalidates the Jewish and Zionist trauma of being oppressed. Takeaways. It is my hope that the audience will take away from this presentation the need for greater dimensionality and gradation in understanding the social strata, and understanding how these advents will better illuminate the stratification of Jewish communities and the state of Israel. Research value. It is my hope that this research will allow us to understand the socio-political being and movement of Jews and Israel from the 1880 pogroms to our own post-October 7th era and future questions regarding this community and nation state. It will also allow us to observe Zionism more evenly, pushing back against tropes like settler colonialism and apartheid, which I contend are perspectives of the oppressor as meta. Let's go over the literature review. I will utilize trauma theory, which demonstrates that when subjects ascribe Jews or Israel to oppressor status, this invalidates the trauma of being oppressed, and that invalidation acts as a secondary trauma onto the original. I will also rely on structuralism and post-structuralism, demonstrating that Jews and the state of Israel don't neatly fit as oppressor nor oppressed. Let's go over trauma theory. Trauma theory is largely the work of Basil van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. And although it does not primarily deal with trauma invalidation, it does extensively deal with trauma invalidation to suggest that the invalidation of a trauma acts as secondary onto the original. I contend that to be oppressed is a trauma, and the observation of the Jew and the state of Israel as the oppressor is the invalidation of the collective trauma by which Jews and Israel are oppressed. Now let's go over structuralism. Structuralism is largely the work of Ferdinand de Saussure in his book, Course on General Linguistics. He contends that when we take a real material thing or signified and subsume it into a word or category, as in signifier, this is an arbitrary relationship. I contend that so long as it's arbitrary, it's also subjective. Let me give you an example. This is a picture of Manny. I brought him home from the shelter several years ago, and he's in my pack. And many people who would know this particular signified might subsume it into the signifier or word or category of dog. But it's also true that we could take another picture here, and also subsume it into the dog signifier. As a signified, we could subsume it into the dog signifier. And I contend that the reason we can do this is because the relationship between the signified and the signifier is arbitrary, and therefore to group the living creatures in both of these pictures together is subjective. I would say that this intersects with trauma theory because the living creature pictured below, the signified picture below, has retractable claws, and all other all other signifieds subsuming the dog signifier does not have retractable claws. It's only this one picture pictured below. Thus, we invalidate the experience of this lower picture, this lower signified, when we subsume it into the dog signifier. Thus, we intersect structuralism and trauma theory. This sounds like a silly and frivolous example, but it actually becomes quite serious in the socio-political sense, as we will see in the next slide. Let's find out. Let's consider two more signifieds subsumed in a signifier. These are the Jewish people and the state of Israel, right? And as signifieds, we can subsume these constructs into the signifier of the oppressor or the oppressed. And in a New Left paradigm, it's more likely that they would be subsumed into the oppressor signifier. However, to do this would invalidate the collective trauma for the Jewish people of something like the Holocaust. And for the state of Israel, it would invalidate the collective trauma to subsume it as the oppressor, something like the fact that Israel is the one country on earth where there is no anti-Semitism, or at least that's what it tries to be. Now let's go over post-structuralism. I don't rely on post-structuralism quite so heavily in this presentation, but it's important in regards to literary theory, and I think it's useful to go over in the literature review. Post-structuralism is largely the work of Jacques Derrida, among others, and he, like myself, deals with binaries like speech versus writing, man versus woman. However, Derrida and the post-structuralists are concerned with privileging one side of the binary, like speech over writing, man over woman, one side of the binary over the other. What I am doing rather in this presentation is that I'm demonstrating the subjectively defined dividing line amidst the binary, and I'm demonstrating the subjectively defined subsumption process by which we take a signified and subsume it into either category across the binary accordingly. Now let's get into the meat of the argument. This is an example of what I'm calling normative oppression. We have white people, and they are normatively understood as the oppressor. We have people of color, or POC. POC stands for people of color, and they are normatively understood as the oppressed. And we have a binary, a clear dividing line between the white communities as the oppressor and people of color as the oppressed. But I'm going to contend that it does not quite work this way for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people. Rather, for Jews in Israel, it looks a little something like this. That there is data of Jews and Israel which ought be subsumed as the oppressor, but there is data of Jews and Israel which ought be subsumed as the oppressed. It may be true that Jews are the people of the Rothschilds, the sort of Jewish capitalists, but it's also true that they're the people of the socialist Bund. And it's also true in terms of structural anti-Semitism that they've been made to undergo the Holocaust and the pogroms. And the same thing can be said for the state of Israel, that the state of Israel may be a nation state responsible for the dispossession of Palestinian people. This is true, but it's also a nation of asylum seekers. And it's also a nation where there is no anti-Semitism or strives to be no anti-Semitism. And so in this way, for Jews and Israel, there is data which ought subsume itself as oppressor, but there is data also which ought subsume itself as oppressed. And this is true for Jews and the state of Israel. Then we must ask ourselves, what do we make of Holocaust denial? Or for the state of Israel, what do we make of settler colonialism and apartheid? Well, I contend that when we know in this way, what we're doing is something like this. That is to say, in Holocaust denial, we are sort of making this argument, or I should say, many forms of Holocaust denial are trying to make this argument that Jews are the oppressor in Nazi Germany and later Nazi-occupied Europe. And it's the same thing with the state of Israel. We're trying to make this argument that we see settler colonialism and we see apartheid, but we disregard the data by which there is no anti-Semitism in Israel, and we disregard the data by which Israel is a nation of asylum seekers. So it's a subjective observation of the data itself, not just for Jews, but also for the state of Israel. So bringing ourselves back to trauma theory, we may take note that to be oppressed is a trauma, and this data being invalidating, being not observed, right, is the invalidation of the trauma of being oppressed. So in this way, we have two traumas. We have the trauma of being oppressed, and we have the trauma of the invalidation of being oppressed. And when these two traumas come together, there is bound to be a trauma response. And in demonstrating this trauma response, I have pictured here Hostage Square. This is Hostage Square on the day the final hostages were released to the state of Israel, a very galvanized Israeli Jewish community, and I think by extension, a very galvanized world Jewish community. And the reason that this is the case is because it's a response to the collective trauma of being oppressed and the collective trauma of the invalidation of being oppressed.